A bankrupt millionaire allowed the little beggar to sleep in his chocolate factory for one night. At dawn, he was completely paralyzed to see what the boy had done to his factory. Thunder cracked across the sky as police officers surrounded Michael's chocolate factory. The old building stood defiant against the stormy backdrop, its weathered walls holding decades of memories. Inside, 12-year-old David Ryan clutched a worn folder to his chest, his honey-brown eyes fixed on Michael Harrison, who was struggling to stay upright at the factory's entrance. "You can't take this place," Michael's voice wavered as he faced the officers, his legs trembling from the strain of his illness. "This factory is more than just a building, it's our home." Laura Reynolds emerged from a black sedan, her designer heels clicking against the wet pavement. Behind her, Vicente Morris, the lawyer responsible for the eviction order, smiled coldly. "Michael, dear, you're making this harder than it needs to be," Laura said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. At that moment, Michael's knees buckled. David rushed forward, catching him before he hit the ground. "Mr. Michael, please hold on," the boy's voice cracked with desperation as he supported the man who had become his only family. But instead of collapsing completely, Michael straightened up, drawing strength from somewhere deep within. David seized the moment, stepping forward with the folder. "Before you do anything, you need to see these documents." His small hands trembled as he held out papers that would change everything. "What nonsense is this?" Vicente started, but his expression shifted as he glimpsed the contents: bank statements, forged signatures, evidence of his fraud spanning years. Laura's perfectly composed facade cracked as she recognized certain transactions. Her manicured hand flew to her mouth, eyes widening with recognition. "Vicente, you promised those records were destroyed." The gathering crowd of factory workers and neighbors pressed closer, sensing the shift in power. Rain continued to fall, but nobody moved. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. "I've seen enough," Laura suddenly announced, her voice carrying over the storm. "Officer, I need to make a statement about Mr. Morris's activities regarding this factory and about what really happened to David's parents 5 years ago." Vicente lunged forward, but 2 officers caught his arms. David stood his ground, lifting his chin as he faced the man who had orchestrated so much pain. Behind him, Michael placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, their shadows merging into one against the factory wall that had brought them together. The storm raged on, but inside the old chocolate factory, the bitter taste of injustice was about to turn sweet with the flavor of long-awaited truth. If this dramatic opening has captivated your imagination, embark on this extraordinary journey with us by subscribing. Your support allows us to continue crafting powerful stories that touch hearts and inspire souls. Every subscription brings more moving tales to life. A month earlier, David Ryan huddled in the corner of St. Mary's Orphanage, his thin frame shivering despite the summer heat. The 12-year-old's tan skin bore fresh bruises, testament to another disciplinary action from Mr. Walters, the head caretaker who seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting him. Through the barred window, David watched the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. 5 years had passed since the mysterious fire that claimed his parents' lives, leaving him with nothing but fragmented memories of warm hugs and the sweet scent of his mother's hot chocolate. The official report called it an accident, but David had always sensed there was more to the story. "Boy, where's the inventory list?" I asked, for Mr. Walters' voice boomed down the corridor. David's heart raced as heavy footsteps approached his room. He had finished the list hours ago, but experience taught him that accuracy meant little to Mr. Walters. The man would find fault regardless. David's fingers traced the small scar above his eyebrow, a reminder of his first escape attempt 2 years ago. That time, he'd made it 3 blocks before the police brought him back. The punishment that followed ensured he'd think twice before trying again. Yet here he was, planning another escape, because sometimes survival meant taking impossible risks. In his pocket, he felt the crumpled newspaper clipping about Michael Harrison's chocolate factory. He'd been collecting information about local businesses, looking for somewhere anywhere that might offer shelter. The factory had been in the news lately, stories about financial troubles and potential closure, but something about it called to him. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother's chocolate, or maybe just desperation for a place where the walls didn't feel like a cage. After lights out, David waited until the night guard's footsteps faded. His few possessions were already wrapped in a small bundle beneath his thin blanket. The lock on the back gate had been broken for weeks, ignored by the maintenance staff who cared as little about repairs as they did about the children. As he slipped from his bed, a floorboard creaked. David froze, heart pounding. Down the hall, another boy stirred but didn't wake. He thought of Tommy, his only friend here, who had disappeared last month after a particularly brutal beating. The official story claimed Tommy had been transferred to another facility, but David had seen the look in the boy's eyes the night before Hollow, defeated beyond hope. "I won't end up like Tommy," David whispered to himself as he crept down the corridor. "I won't let them break me." The night air hit his face like freedom as he squeezed through the gap in the gate. His bare feet made no sound on the wet pavement as he ran, each step taking him further from the nightmare of St. Mary's. Rain began to fall, but David welcomed it. It would make tracking him harder. As he ran, memories of his mother's voice echoed in his mind sometimes. "Sweetheart, the bravest thing we can do is start over." He hadn't understood what she meant back then, but now, running through the dark streets with nothing but hope and determination, her words gave him strength. David didn't stop until he reached the industrial district, where the imposing silhouette of Michael's chocolate factory loomed against the night sky. The faded letters above the entrance seemed to welcome him, promising shelter from both the rain and his past. Through a broken window, the faint scent of chocolate still lingered, reminding him of happier times. "Please," he whispered to the empty building, "let this be my chance to start over." What David couldn't know as he searched for a way inside was that this desperate escape would set in motion events that would change not only his life but the lives of everyone connected to the old chocolate factory. Sometimes the bravest choices lead to the most unexpected destinations, and on that rainy night, David Ryan's courage was about to lead him straight into the heart of a story much bigger than himself. Michael Harrison stood at the window of his office, watching the rain streak down the glass as he pressed a hand to his throbbing temple. The factory floor below lay silent, machines gathering dust, a far cry from the bustling chocolate wonderland his mother had built from nothing 50 years ago. The persistent headaches had become his constant companion, much like the mounting bills and creditors' calls he couldn't escape. The latest medical report lay unopened on his desk, its pristine white envelope mocking him. He already knew what it would say: the tumor was growing, treatment was essential, and time was running out. But treatment meant money, and money was the one thing he didn't have, not since the gambling addiction had spiraled out of control 3 years ago. Just one more bet to save the factory, he'd told himself back then. That's how it always started: one more bet, one more chance, one more roll of the dice. By the time he'd realized his mistake, half the factory's assets were gone, and Laura, his wife of 15 years, had walked out the door with their shared dreams in tatters. Running his fingers along the old production line, Michael remembered his mother's words: "Chocolate isn't just a sweet, Michael. It's hope wrapped in happiness." She'd built this place during the Great Depression, using her grandmother's recipes and an unshakable belief that everyone deserved a moment of joy, even in the darkest times. The machines stood like silent sentinels, their brass fittings still gleaming despite the layer of dust. Each one had a name, given by his mother Betsy: the temperamental tempering machine Old Faithful, the sturdy mixer Princess, the delicate enrobing Line. To others, they were just equipment, but to Michael, they were family, witnesses to both his greatest triumphs and deepest failures. A sharp pain shot through his head, forcing him to grip the railing for support. The doctors had been clear without treatment. He had months at best, but the factory needed every penny he could scrape together. The choice tortured him: his life or his mother's legacy. Some days the answer wasn't as clear as it should have been. Vicente, Laura's lawyer, had made multiple offers to buy the factory, each one more insulting than the last. "It's a mercy killing," he'd said with that snake oil smile. "The property alone is worth more than the business." But Michael knew what they really wanted: the land for their luxury development project, another soulless monument to profit where something meaningful once stood. The workers, who remained just a handful now, were more family than employees. They'd stuck with him through the worst, accepting delayed payments and reduced hours without complaint. Their loyalty made his failure feel even heavier. Each day he saw the worry in their eyes when he stumbled or forgot a name, signs of the disease slowly eating away at his mind. Thunder rolled outside as Michael made his way to the small kitchen where his mother had perfected her recipes. The old recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages yellow with age, edges worn soft by generations of loving hands. His fingers traced his mother's handwriting, elegant loops and swirls that spelled out not just ingredients but love, dedication, and the magic that had made Harrison's chocolates famous throughout the state. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered to the empty room. "I tried to keep your dream alive, but I've failed everyone: the workers, Laura, myself, and worst of all, you." The pain intensified, forcing him to sit. Through the window he could see the "for sale" sign swaying in the wind, a constant reminder of his impending defeat. But something in him refused to give up entirely. Maybe it was his mother's spirit, or perhaps just plain stubbornness, but he wouldn't let go without a fight. What Michael didn't know as he sat there battling his pain and regrets was that hope was about to arrive in the most unexpected form: a scared, determined boy seeking shelter from the storm. Sometimes salvation comes not when we're strongest, but when we're most broken, ready to be rebuilt by the hands of fate. In her luxurious downtown office, Laura Reynolds stared at the old photograph hidden in her desk drawer. The image showed a happier time: the Ryan family, David's parents, standing proudly in front of their small bakery. Sarah Ryan's warm smile mirrored her son's, while James Ryan's protective stance spoke volumes about his devotion to his family. Laura's manicured fingers trembled as she touched the photo's worn edges, guilt gnawing at her conscience. Still dwelling on the past, Vicente Morris's voice cut through her thoughts as he entered without knocking. Her brother's presence always brought a chill to the room, despite his impeccable suits and practiced charm. As David's maternal uncle, he should have been the boy's guardian after the fire, but he'd orchestrated events to ensure that never happened. "He looks so much like Sarah now," Laura whispered, unable to meet Vicente's gaze. "When I saw him at the factory yesterday, for a moment I thought." "Don't get sentimental now," Sister Vicente interrupted, his voice sharp. "Remember what we agreed. The Ryan family's bakery stood in the way of our development plans. What happened was unfortunate but necessary. Business is business." Laura's mind drifted to 5 years ago when she'd first married Michael Harrison. She'd discovered the truth about Vicente's involvement in the fire that claimed the Ryans' lives, a tragic accident that cleared the way for their real estate empire. The guilt had driven her to drink, contributing to her failed marriage with Michael. "David doesn't know I was the one who convinced his mother to reject the insurance renewal," Laura said, her voice barely audible. "If I'd known what you were planning." Vicente slammed his hand on the desk, making her jump. "What's done is done. Focus on the present. Michael's factory sits on the last piece of land we need. Once we acquire it, the past won't matter anymore." But the past did matter. Laura remembered how she'd helped Vicente falsify documents after the fire, ensuring David ended up in the system rather than with family. She'd told herself it was for the best. What could a grieving, alcoholic uncle offer a traumatized child? Now, seeing David's resilience at the factory, protected by Michael's kindness, She wondered if she'd made the worst mistake of all. The boy's clever Vicente mused, straightening his tie. He started digging into old records. If he connects the dots between the fire and our development projects. He's just a child, Laura protested, but her brother's cold laugh cut her off. A child who inherited his mother's stubbornness and his father's sense of justice. Sarah always did ask too many questions about our business practices. Like mother, like son. Laura closed the drawer, but couldn't shut away her remorse so easily. She'd watched from afar as David grew up in the orphanage, sending anonymous gifts on his birthday, small attempts to ease her conscience. Now, seeing him find a home with Michael, her ex-husband of all people, felt like divine irony. "What are you planning, Vicente?" she asked, dreading the answer. Her brother's smile didn't reach his eyes. Nothing drastic, just ensuring that both Michael and his young ward understand the futility of resistance. After all, Harrison's chocolate factory will make a perfect centerpiece for our new development after we tear it down. As Vicente left, Laura opened her laptop to the hidden folder containing everything she knew about the fire, the fraudulent documents, and Vicente's manipulation. She'd kept these records as insurance, telling herself she'd never use them. But watching David fight for the factory, seeing him finally find happiness with Michael, made her question everything she'd helped her brother accomplish. Sometimes redemption requires more than regret, it demands action. Laura's finger hovered over the folder, her heart racing as she contemplated the cost of finally doing the right thing. The broken window at the back of Harrison's chocolate factory barely made a sound as David slipped through, his small frame easily fitting through the gap. The musty air inside carried traces of cocoa and vanilla, triggering memories of his mother's kitchen that made his heart ache. Moonlight filtered through dusty windows, casting strange shadows across dormant machinery. David's bare feet left prints in the dust as he explored, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Unlike the sterile corridors of St. Mary's orphanage, this place felt alive despite its abandonment, as if the walls themselves held stories waiting to be told. Each step deeper into the factory revealed new wonders, giant mixing vats gleaming dully in the moonlight, conveyor belts stretching into shadows, and mysterious machines whose purposes he could only imagine. In what must have been the experimental kitchen, David found an old notebook, its pages yellow with age. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing handwritten recipes in elegant script. Sarah's special dark chocolate one-page read, making his breath catch his mother's name. But before he could process this discovery, a noise from the main floor made him freeze. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, accompanied by unsteady footsteps. David ducked behind a large tempering machine, his heart pounding so loud he feared it would give him away. Through a gap in the machinery, he watched a man shuffle into view, Michael Harrison, though David didn't know his name yet. Michael looked worse than the newspaper photos had shown. His face was gaunt, his movements uncertain as he steadied himself against a workbench. "Happy birthday, old girl," he muttered, patting the nearest machine. "Wish I could get you running again." One last batch of chocolate before his voice trailed off as another wave of dizziness seemed to hit him. David watched, torn between hiding and helping, as Michael slumped against the workbench. The man's obvious love for the factory touched something in David's soul. Here was someone else who saw more than just an abandoned building. Without thinking, he stepped from his hiding place. "Sir? Are you all right?" David's voice echoed in the empty space. Michael startled, nearly dropping his flashlight. "Who's there? Show yourself!" David emerged from the shadows, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm sorry for breaking in. I didn't have anywhere else to go." The flashlight beam illuminated David's face, revealing his bruises and dirt-streaked cheeks. Michael's stern expression softened. "You're just a boy." "What happened to you, son?" Something in Michael's voice, concern without pity, Kindness without condescension broke through David's carefully constructed walls. The story spilled out the orphanage, the abuse, his escape. He clutched the recipe book to his chest as he spoke, drawing strength from its connection to his past. Michael listened without interrupting, his own pain seemingly forgotten. When David finished, silence filled the factory for a long moment. Then Michael did something unexpected. He smiled. "Well, since you're here, how about some hot chocolate? Can't properly welcome a guest without it." My mother always said. He gestured toward the experimental kitchen. "That is, if you'll help an old man find his way around his own factory. These days I sometimes get a bit turned around." David followed Michael to the kitchen, where they found an ancient hot plate still in working order. As Michael gathered ingredients, David opened the recipe book again, this time showing Michael the page that had caught his eye. "Sarah's special dark chocolate," Michael read, his eyes widening. "Sarah Ryan's recipe. She was one of our best customers, always experimenting with our chocolate in her bakery. You said your mother's name was Sarah." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She used to make the best hot chocolate on rainy days." Michael studied the boy's face more closely. "I remember her son. Would be about your age now. There was a fire." 5 years ago, David whispered. "They said it was an accident." Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes, followed by something else: determination. "Well, David Ryan, it seems this factory has been waiting for you. What do you say we try your mother's recipe?" As they worked together in the pre-dawn darkness, master and apprentice, neither could have known they were brewing more than just chocolate. They were mixing the ingredients of a new beginning, a chance for both the broken man and the lost boy to find what they needed most: family. The factory, silent for so long, seemed to come alive around them, as if welcoming home a long-lost child. Sometimes the sweetest mysteries of life unfold in the most unexpected places, even in an abandoned chocolate factory at 3 in the morning. Steam rose from the ancient hot plate as Michael guided David through the intricacies of tempering chocolate. The boy's hands were steady, his concentration absolute as he watched the dark mixture swirl. Morning light had begun to creep through the factory windows, but neither noticed the passing time, too engrossed in their shared task. "The secret," Michael explained, his voice gaining strength as he shared his mother's wisdom, "isn't just in the temperature. It's in the patience, the rhythm. Chocolate tells its own story, you just have to learn to listen." He watched as David adjusted the heat with an intuition that seemed almost inherited. "Mum used to say something similar," David said softly, his eyes fixed on the melting chocolate. "She said chocolate was like people treat them too roughly, and they turn bitter. Give them time and care, and they reveal their sweetness." Michael nodded, fighting back unexpected tears. "Your mother was a wise woman. Sarah always understood chocolate better than most. When she'd visit the factory, she and my mother would spend hours experimenting with new flavors." As they worked, David revealed more about his life at the orphanage: the loneliness, the fear, the small acts of rebellion that kept his spirit alive. Michael shared his own stories: the factory's golden days, his mother's legacy, and gradually his recent struggles with illness and debt. "The doctors say it's a tumor," Michael admitted, watching David carefully pour the tempered chocolate into molds. "Treatment's expensive, and the factory's not doing well. Vicente, my ex-wife's lawyer, keeps pushing me to sell." David's hands didn't waver as he worked, but his voice carried a fierce protectiveness. "You can't sell it. This place is special. It's like it has a soul." The boy's words echoed Michael's own feelings. Together, they watched the chocolate slowly set, forming perfect squares with a glossy finish that would have made Sarah Ryan proud. David's first batch was flawless, a natural talent that stirred something deep in Michael's memory. "You have your mother's gift," Michael said, resting a hand on David's shoulder. She could always tell when chocolate was ready just by looking at it. Not everyone can do that. David beamed at the praise, then hesitated. "Mr. Michael, what if we restarted the factory? Not all at once, but maybe start small. I could help. I'm good at fixing things and I learn fast." Before Michael could respond, a coughing fit seized him. David quickly helped him to a chair, his young face lined with worry. When the spell passed, Michael looked at the boy who'd appeared in his factory like an answer to an unspoken prayer. It would be hard work, Michael warned. Long hours, uncertain success. And there's my health to consider. "I'm not afraid of hard work," David insisted. "At the orphanage, they said I was troublesome because I asked too many questions. But really, I just wanted to understand how things worked. Please, Mr. Michael, give me a chance to prove I can help." Looking at the perfectly tempered chocolates, at the hope shining in David's eyes, Michael made a decision that would change both their lives. "Well then, apprentice, let's see what we can do with this old place. First lesson, every Harrison's chocolate tells a story. What story shall we tell with these?" David considered the chocolates thoughtfully. "A story about new beginnings, about finding home when you least expect it." "Perfect," Michael smiled, feeling stronger than he had in months. "Now, let me show you my mother's secret ingredient, the one that made Harrison's chocolates famous." As they worked side by side, the factory seemed to come alive around them. The morning sun caught dust motes dancing in the air like golden possibilities. Neither Michael nor David knew they were being watched through the factory window by Laura, her face a mask of conflicting emotions as she witnessed their growing bond. For the first time since losing his parents, David felt the warmth of belonging. And Michael, facing his own mortality, found new purpose in teaching this remarkable boy the art of chocolate making. Some bonds are formed not by blood but by something sweet as shared dreams, understanding, and the magic that happens when two broken hearts find healing in each other's company. The chocolate they made that morning wasn't just confection, it was a promise, a beginning, and perhaps most importantly, proof that sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped not in fancy paper, but in the simple joy of finding someone who believes in you. Laura's heels echoed through the factory corridor as she strode in unannounced, Vicente following like a shadow. The sound drew Michael and David from the experimental kitchen where they'd been perfecting a new truffle recipe. David instinctively stepped behind Michael when he saw her chocolate-stained apron clutched tight. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Laura's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Harboring a runaway, Michael? I expected better judgment. Even from you." She produced a document from her designer handbag. "The orphanage reported him missing 3 days ago. As a concerned citizen, I filed for emergency guardianship." Michael's hand found David's shoulder, steadying them both. "He's not a runaway, Laura. He's an apprentice chocolatier who happened to find his way home." Home? Laura's laugh was sharp. "This failing factory. You can barely take care of yourself, Michael. The tumor, the debts, do you really think you're fit to care for a child?" David stepped forward, his voice stronger than he felt. "Mr. Michael is teaching me everything about chocolate. He's the only one who's ever given me a chance." Laura's expression softened momentarily, something like pain flickering across her features. "David, sweetie, I knew your mother. Sarah would want you somewhere stable, safe, not in this crumbling monument to Michael's failures." The mention of his mother made David freeze. "You knew my mom?" "We were acquaintances." Laura hesitated, shooting a warning glance at Vicente. "Which is partly why I feel responsible for your welfare. The courts will agree that a successful businesswoman can provide better care than a bankrupt factory owner with medical issues." Michael stepped between them, his voice low but firm. "You've never shown interest in any child's welfare before, Laura. Why start now?" "Perhaps I'm trying to make amends," she replied, but her eyes betrayed her. "Vicente, show them the preliminary custody papers." As Vicente approached with the documents, David noticed something familiar about his face, a resemblance to old photos of his mother that made his heart race. Before he could process this, Michael swayed slightly, one hand going to his head. "Mr. Michael," David grabbed his arm, supporting him. "You need to sit down. Laura moved forward as if to help, genuine concern breaking through her practiced facade. "Michael, be reasonable. You can barely stand. How can you possibly care for a child?" "I'm not leaving him," David declared, helping Michael to a chair. "You can't make me go with you. I'll just run away again." Actually, Vicente interjected smoothly. "Given the circumstances, we can. The court will rule in Laura's favor, especially once they learn about Michael's deteriorating condition." Michael looked up at Laura, his voice quiet but steady. "Why are you really doing this, Laura? What's Vicente not telling me?" Something in Michael's tone made Laura falter. She glanced at the chocolate-making equipment, at David's determined face smeared with cocoa, at the recipe book open to Sarah's special blend. For a moment she seemed to wage an internal battle. "The boy needs structure, stability," she finally said, but her words sounded hollow. "I'm offering him a better life." "Better than learning his mother's craft? Better than continuing Sarah Ryan's legacy?" Michael challenged. "Look at him, Laura. Really look. He has her gift." Laura did look, and what she saw made her step back. David stood protecting Michael, chocolate-stained hands clenched, his expression a mirror of Sarah's determination, the same determination she'd shown the night of the fire when she'd refused to sell her bakery to Vicente's development company. "We'll let the courts decide," Vicente cut in, placing the papers on a nearby table. "In the meantime, consider this notice of our intent to file. Come, Laura." As they left, David turned to Michael, his voice shaking. "Why did she mention my mom? And Mr. Vicente, he looks like." "Like your mother's photos," Michael finished, his face grave. "David, I think there's more to your parents' story than we know. But whatever it is, I promise you this, I won't let them take you away. We're family now, you and I. Family stands together." David hugged Michael fiercely, getting chocolate on both their clothes. Neither cared. Outside, Laura sat in her car, watching them through the factory window. A single tear rolled down her cheek as she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd sworn never to use. "Hello? Yes, I need to report some irregularities in the Ryan family fire investigation. It's time the truth came out." The hospital corridor seemed endless as David ran, his footsteps echoing off sterile walls. Behind him, the sound of Michael's collapse in the factory kitchen still rang in his ears, the crash of falling pots, the terrible silence that followed. Now, racing past surprised nurses and orderlies, David clutched Michael's medical file, stolen from the doctor's cart when no one was looking. But Dr. Isabella Thompson found him huddled in the waiting room, papers spread across his lap, tears streaming down his face as he struggled to understand the medical terminology. She knelt beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "David, those records are confidential. How did you get them?" "Please," David's voice cracked. "I need to know what's happening to him. He won't tell me the truth, but I see him getting worse every day. The headaches, the dizzy spells, how he forgets things." Dr. Thompson sighed, settling into the chair beside him. "The tumor is growing faster than we expected. Without immediate treatment," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Michael has maybe 3 months, 4 if we're lucky." David's hands trembled as he gathered the scattered papers. "But there's treatment, right? Surgery or medicine or something?" "Yes, but it's expensive. Michael's insurance lapsed months ago, and the procedure costs more than the factory makes in a year." She touched David's shoulder gently. "He's been refusing treatment to keep the factory running. To keep you safe." The reality of Michael's sacrifice hit David like a physical blow. Every chocolate sale, every repair they'd made to the old machines, Michael had been choosing the factory's survival over his own, choosing David's future over his own life. "No," David whispered, then louder, "No, he can't do this. He can't just give up." "David," Dr. Thompson began, but the boy was already moving, racing toward Michael's room with desperate determination. He burst through the door to find Michael awake, looking frail against the white hospital sheets. The sight stopped David in his tracks. This man who'd become his father in every way that mattered, who'd taught him not just about chocolate but about love, trust, and the courage to begin again, how had he not seen how ill he truly was? "The doctors told you, didn't they?" Michael asked softly. David crossed the room, clutching the bed rail. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have found a way. Sold something, worked harder, anything. And risked losing the factory." "Your home," Michael shook his head. "The factory is more than just a building, David. It's your heritage now, your mother's legacy as much as mine. I couldn't bear to see it sold off piece by piece for medical bills that might not even save me." "I don't care about the factory," David's voice broke. "I care about you. You're the only family I have left. Please, please don't leave me alone again." Michael reached for David's hand, his grip weaker than the boy remembered. "Listen to me, son. Every moment since you climbed through that broken window has been a gift. You gave me back my purpose, my joy in chocolate making. If these are to be my last months, I want to spend them teaching you everything I know, not lying in a hospital bed." "But what about Laura? Vicente? They'll take everything the factory me." "Then we'll fight them," Michael said firmly. "Together for as long as we can. Your mother never gave up, even when things seemed hopeless. Neither will we." David wiped his eyes with his chocolate-stained sleeve, a plan already forming. 3 months. "Okay. Then we have work to do. First, we're going to make enough money for your treatment. I've been experimenting with Mum's recipes, adding my own ideas. People already love our chocolates, we just need to make more, sell more." "David." "No arguments," David interrupted, his voice steady now. "You taught me that chocolate tells stories. Well, this is our story, and it's not ending here. Tomorrow we're going back to the factory, and we're going to make the best chocolate anyone's ever tasted. People will line up around the block, you'll see." Michael looked at his young apprentice, no, his son, and saw Sarah's determination shining through. Perhaps it was the medication making him emotional, but he could almost smell chocolate in the sterile hospital room, could almost see a future beyond these 3 months. "All right," he conceded, managing a smile. "But you'll need help. The old machines." "Already figured it out," David said, pulling a notebook from his back pocket. "I've been studying the repair manuals. We can fix them, modify them, make them better than new." As David outlined his plans, his voice growing stronger with each detail, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in months' hope. Not just for the factory's survival, but for a future he might actually live to see. Neither noticed Laura standing in the doorway, listening. She clutched her handbag, inside which lay documents that could change everything: the truth about Sarah's death, Vicente's involvement, the rightful ownership of both the bakery and the factory. But watching father and son plan their future over hospital sheets, she wondered if perhaps the truth could wait just a little longer. Some battles, after all, needed perfect timing, and some bonds she realized were too precious to break. The local newspaper's headline screamed across the front page: "Harrison's chocolate factory faces closure, gambling debts, and medical bills threaten historic business." David stared at the words until they blurred, his hands shaking as he stood in the factory's main hall. Around him, the remaining workers gathered, their faces a mixture of concern and betrayal. "Is it true, Mr. Michael?" Sarah Jenkins, their oldest employee, held up the paper. "Did you really gamble away our pension fund?" Her voice cracked with 40 years of loyalty strained to breaking point. Michael leaned heavily against a workbench, his face ashen. Vicente had done his work well, every painful detail laid bare for public consumption. The secret loans, the desperate attempts to recover losses, even the medical reports about his tumor. All of it splashed across the morning news like cheap sensationalism. "I can explain," Michael started, but Tom Anderson, their master chocolatier, cut him off. "Explain what?" "How you kept this from us for months. We trusted you, Michael. Some of us have been here since your mother ran the place." We deserve the truth." David stepped forward, positioning himself between the workers and Michael. "It's not what you think. Mr. Michael was trying to protect everyone's jobs. He's been selling his own possessions, working while sick." "And taking in strays," someone muttered, making David flinch. "No offense, kid, but maybe if he'd focused on the business instead of playing father." Enough, Michael's voice carried unexpected strength. "Attack me if you must, but leave David out of this. He's done more to save this factory in a few weeks than I managed in years." The factory floor fell silent except for the distant drip of a leaking pipe. Michael straightened, facing his workers with dignity despite his obvious exhaustion. "Yes, I made terrible mistakes. The gambling. It started after my mother died. I thought I could make enough to modernize the factory, keep up with the big corporations. Instead, I nearly destroyed everything she built." He paused, steadying himself. "But I've been clean for months now. Every penny we've made has gone back into the business or set aside for your wages." Sarah stepped forward, her anger softening. "And the medical bills? The paper says you need surgery." "The factory comes first," Michael said firmly. "Your jobs, your families." "No," David's voice rang out clear and determined. "Everyone needs to know the whole truth. Mr. Michael's been refusing treatment to keep the factory running. He has 3 months left without surgery, the same surgery he could have had if he hadn't used the money to pay our salaries." The revelation hit the workers like a physical blow. Tom Anderson removed his apron slowly, then walked to the wall where generations of Harrison's chocolate workers had hung their uniforms with pride. Instead of leaving his there, he put it back on. "Well," he said gruffly, "guess we better start making some serious chocolate then. How much do we need for the surgery?" One by one, the workers moved closer, anger turning to determination. Sarah Jenkins pulled out her phone. "My daughter's a social media manager. She can help us promote online. People love historic businesses with heart." "I know some food bloggers," another worker offered. "If we invite them to tour the factory, show them our traditional methods." David watched in amazement as the very people who'd been ready to walk out moments ago began planning their comeback. Michael swayed slightly, overwhelmed by emotion, and David quickly helped him to a chair. "See," David whispered. "They care about you too. We're all family here." Just then, Laura appeared in the doorway, Vicente close behind. She surveyed the scene with calculated interest. "How touching," Vicente sneered, "but sentiment won't pay the bills. The bank's foreclosure notice is already filed. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Instead of the despair he'd expected, Vicente found himself facing a united front of determined faces. Tom Anderson stepped forward, still wearing his newly reclaimed apron. "We'll see about that. Some of us have savings, if we all chip in." "I'll sell my car," Sarah Jenkins added. "And my vacation fund," called another voice. Laura watched the scene unfold, her carefully constructed plans crumbling. She hadn't expected this level of loyalty, this depth of commitment to a failing factory and its flawed owner. "You're all fools," Vicente spat. "This place is dead. Michael killed it with his weakness, and no amount of teamwork will change that." "You're wrong," David declared, standing tall despite his youth. "Harrison's Chocolates isn't just a building or a business. It's every person in this room. It's every recipe we've perfected, every batch we've made with love. And we're not giving up." The workers cheered, the sound echoing off the old walls like a battle cry. Michael looked at his assembled family workers, loyal friends, and the boy who'd brought them all together, and felt stronger than he had in months. Let Vicente plot. Let the banks threaten. Some things were worth fighting for, and as he watched David organize the workers into teams, Michael knew they'd just found their second wind. The factory's heart was beating stronger than ever, powered by something sweeter than chocolate hope. Late that night, while searching through old factory records for anything that might help save the business, David discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in Michael's office. Inside lay a stack of yellowed photographs and newspaper clippings. His heart stopped when he recognized his mother's face smiling up at him from a factory Christmas party photo standing next to a younger Laura. "No," David whispered, his fingers trembling as he read the caption. "Employee of the Year Sarah Reynolds, now Sarah Ryan, with sister Laura Reynolds, 1999." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the truth crashed over him. Laura wasn't just someone who'd known his mother, she was his aunt. Michael found him still sitting on the office floor, photographs spread around him like fallen leaves. One look at David's face told him everything. "You found them," he said softly, easing himself into his chair. "She's my aunt," David's voice cracked. "All this time." She knew. She knew, and she left me in that orphanage. Why? Why didn't she take me in after the fire? Before Michael could respond, a voice from the doorway answered. "Because I was a coward." Laura stood there, her usual polished facade cracking. "And because Vicente threatened to expose my part in what happened if I tried to claim you." David stood, photographs clutched in his hands. "Your part? What did you do?" Laura entered the office slowly, as if each step pained her. "Your mother and I. We were close once, best friends as well as sisters. She worked here at the factory while putting herself through culinary school. That's how she met your father." She touched one of the photographs gently. "But then Vicente started his development company. He wanted to buy the entire block, including your parents' bakery." "They wouldn't sell," David said, remembering fragments of overheard arguments from his childhood. "No, they wouldn't." Vicente was furious. He asked me to help convince Sarah. When that failed, he suggested cancelling their insurance policy. I thought he just wanted to pressure them into selling. I never imagined. Laura's voice broke. "I never thought he would." "The fire," Michael said quietly. "Vicente set it." Laura nodded, tears falling freely now. "I found out afterward. By then it was too late. Vicente had documents proving I'd helped him pressure Sarah. He said if I tried to adopt you, he'd make sure I went to prison. So I stayed away, thinking it was better for you to have a chance at a fresh start than be tied to your mother's murderer." David backed away from her, bumping into Michael's desk. "You let him kill them. You let him put me in that orphanage. You watched while Mr. Walters he couldn't continue, the memories of abuse too fresh." Michael started to rise, but another wave of dizziness forced him back down. "I've kept records," Laura said quickly. "Everything Vicente did, everything I knew. I was too much of a coward to use them before, but seeing you here with Michael, seeing how he loves you like his own." She pulled an envelope from her bag. "It's all here. Enough to put Vicente away and prove your parents' deaths weren't accidental." David looked at the envelope, then at Michael, who nodded encouragingly. With shaking hands, he took it. "Why now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because Michael's showing me what real courage looks like, fighting for this factory despite everything. And because Laura took a deep breath. Because Sarah would never forgive me if I let Vicente destroy your chance at happiness again." David opened the envelope, scanning documents that proved Vicente's guilt and Laura's complicity. When he looked up, his eyes were steel. "If you really want to make things right, these need to go to the police. All of them. Even the ones that implicate you." Laura straightened her shoulders, looking more like Sarah Ryan than ever. "I know. That's why I brought copies to the district attorney this morning. Vicente should be getting a visit from the police any minute now." As if on cue, they heard sirens in the distance. Michael reached for David's hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." David looked at Laura, seeing for the first time the shadow of his mother in her features. He wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But as the sirens grew closer and the truth of his past finally came to light, he felt something shift inside him, not healing, exactly, but the possibility of it. Sometimes the bitterest truths, like the darkest chocolate, could become something richer with time. The morning after Vicente's arrest, Harrison's chocolate factory awoke to an unexpected sight. A line of people stretched around the block, some holding old chocolate boxes, others clutching newspaper clippings about the factory's troubles. Sarah Jenkins' social media campaign had worked better than anyone could have imagined. My grandmother used to bring me here every Saturday. An elderly woman told the local news crew that had gathered to cover the story. Harrison's chocolates were part of every special moment in our lives. We can't let this piece of history die. Inside, David and Michael scrambled to prepare for the sudden influx of support. The boy moved between machines with growing confidence, showing volunteers how to temper chocolate properly, while Michael, though weak, sat at a workbench sharing stories of the factory's glory days with anyone who would listen. "Remember when your mother made those special Christmas truffles, Mrs. Anderson?" the baker from 3 streets over asked as she helped wrap chocolates. "The ones with the gold dust that sparkled like snow? My James proposed to me over one of those." The story sparked something in David's memory. The recipe book. He rushed to fetch his mother's old notebook. "Mr. Michael, look, there's a whole section on celebration chocolates. We could bring them back." Local businesses began showing up with offers of help. The hardware store owner cancelled Michael's repair bills. The print shop provided free packaging materials. Even the bank manager arrived, not with foreclosure papers, but with a proposal for restructuring the debt. "My daughter's wedding," he explained, somewhat embarrassed. "Your mother made the chocolate favors. Never tasted anything like them since. Maybe we can work something out." By midday, the factory hummed with activity. Former employees returned to their old posts, training newcomers in the art of chocolate making. David moved between groups, his mother's recipe book clutched proudly to his chest, sharing the secrets that had been passed down through generations of both the Harrison and Ryan families. A local chef, who'd trained under Sarah Ryan, arrived with his entire kitchen staff. "Sarah taught me everything I know about chocolate," he announced. "Time to pay it forward. Where do you need us?" Laura, watching from the office doorway, saw her chance for redemption. She approached David cautiously. "That display case in the front window, your mother designed it. She always said presentation was as important as taste. Maybe we could." David hesitated, then nodded. Together they began arranging chocolates in elegant patterns, each piece telling part of the factory's story. As they worked, Laura quietly shared memories of Sarah, her dedication to perfection, her infectious laugh, her dream of combining the bakery's innovations with Harrison's traditional chocolate making. The local paper ran a feature, "Historic Factory Fights Back, a tale of 2 families united by chocolate." The story of Michael's sacrifice, David's determination, and the community's response touched hearts across the city. Orders began pouring in from restaurants and hotels that had long since switched to mass-produced alternatives. A food critic who'd grown up in the neighborhood wrote a viral blog post about the factory's revival in a world of automated, soulless confectionery. Harrison's represents something precious: chocolate made with heart, history, and hope. As the sun set on that extraordinary day, Michael watched David teaching a group of children how to pipe chocolate decorations, his face glowing with pride and purpose. The boy had inherited more than just his mother's talent. He had her gift for bringing people together through the simple magic of well-made chocolate. "Your mother would be proud," Michael said softly when David finally took a break. "Not just of the chocolates, but of how you've helped bring this community together." David looked around at the bustling factory, at Laura carefully packaging gift boxes, at the volunteers cleaning equipment, at the former employees who'd returned to their posts as if they'd never left. "We're not just saving a factory, are we? We're saving a family. Lots of families." Mrs. Thompson from the flower shop next door burst in with an announcement: "The Historical Society's on board. They're fast-tracking the application to declare the factory a protected landmark. Vicente won't be able to touch this place even if he makes bail." The cheer that went up shook dust from the rafters. Michael, overcome with emotion, had to sit down. David was instantly at his side, but for once the weakness in his mentor's face didn't spark fear, it strengthened his resolve. "Tomorrow," David declared, addressing the gathered crowd, "we start working on raising money for Mr. Michael's surgery. Every chocolate we sell brings us closer. Who's with me?" The response was unanimous. People began offering suggestions, organizing fundraising events, planning chocolate-making workshops. Someone suggested charging for factory tours. Another proposed special edition legacy boxes featuring Sarah Ryan's original recipes. "We could do chocolate-making classes," one of the returning workers suggested. "David could teach them. He's got a natural way of explaining things." The boy blushed but stood straighter. "Only if Mr. Michael feels up to supervising. We do this together or not at all." As night fell and the last volunteers reluctantly headed home, promises to return tomorrow on their lips, David and Michael sat in the quiet factory. The air was rich with the scent of chocolate and possibility. "I never thought I'd see this place so alive again," Michael mused, his voice tired but content. "Your mother once told me that chocolate wasn't just about taste, it was about bringing people together, creating moments of joy. I think she'd be happy to see how you've done exactly that." David touched the recipe book gently. "We're not finished yet. Not until you're better and the factory's secure. But today felt like a miracle." Sometimes, Michael smiled, miracles come wrapped in chocolate. Outside, the city settled into night, but lights still burned in Harrison's chocolate factory, where a boy and his chosen father continued planning tomorrow's batches, surrounded by the love of a community that had remembered what it meant to be family. Under the warm glow of the factory lights, David stood before his most ambitious creation, yet a chocolate sculpture that told the story of Harrison's through intricate, edible art. The piece combined Michael's traditional techniques with Sarah Ryan's innovative flavor combinations, creating something entirely new yet deeply rooted in history. "It's for the International Chocolate Makers Competition," he explained to the gathered crowd of supporters. "First prize is enough to cover half of Mr. Michael's surgery costs." His hands, steady despite the pressure, carefully added the final details, delicate chocolate ribbons that seemed to dance around the piece. Michael watched from his wheelchair, oxygen tank at his side, but pride shining in his eyes. The past week had seen David transform from apprentice to artist, working through nights to perfect his competition entry, while still managing the factory's daily production. "Tell them about the flavors," son Michael encouraged, his voice weak but warm. David gestured to different sections of the sculpture. The base is dark chocolate infused with local honey, representing the factory's foundation in the community. The middle layer combines Mom's special spice blend with Mr. Michael's classic truffle recipe. And the top. He smiled. "That's something new, something that brings both families together." The local newspaper's food critic, who'd been documenting the factory's revival, leaned in closer. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. How old are you again?" 12, David answered, adding the finishing touches. "But I've had good teachers." He glanced at Michael, then at his mother's recipe book, propped open nearby. The competition judges arrived, their expressions professionally neutral as they examined David's work. The youngest contestant in the competition's history, he stood straight back as they tasted each element, scribbling notes on their clipboards. "The technical execution is remarkable," the head judge commented. "But what truly sets this piece apart is the story it tells. Each flavor builds on the last, creating a narrative through chocolate. Quite extraordinary." Laura, standing in the back, felt tears spring to her eyes as she recognized Sarah's signature flavor combinations in David's work. Her sister's talent lived on in her son's hands in the way he approached each creation with both precision and passion. The announcement came late that afternoon. David's piece had not only won first place but had received the highest score in the competition's history. The prize money, combined with the factory's improving sales, meant Michael's surgery was now within reach. But David wasn't finished. Building on his competition success, he began creating a new line of chocolates that captured people's personal stories. Couples could order anniversary truffles that recreated the flavors of their wedding day. Families commissioned chocolate sculptures that celebrated their histories. Each piece tells a story, David explained to a food magazine interviewer. Just like Mr. Michael taught me, chocolate isn't just about taste, it's about memories, moments, connections. Orders flooded in from across the country. Celebrity chefs praised the young chocolatier's innovative approach. A prestigious culinary school offered him a future scholarship. But David's focus remained on the factory and the man who'd given him a chance when everyone else had turned away. One morning, as David experimented with a new recipe, Michael watched him work with tears in his eyes. "You've surpassed everything I could have taught you," he said softly. "Your mother would be so proud." David paused in his work, his own eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mr. Michael. You gave me more than just chocolate lessons, you gave me a home, a purpose, a family." The factory's revival attracted attention from food critics worldwide. Orders poured in faster than they could fill them. David's story, the orphan boy who saved a historic chocolate factory while reinventing its classics, captured imaginations and hearts. But his proudest moment came when he recreated his mother's signature hot chocolate recipe, the one that had comforted him on rainy days. Serving it to Michael in the hospital the night before his surgery, David watched his mentor's face light up at the familiar taste. "Perfect," Michael whispered. "Absolutely perfect." The success brought more than just financial security. It proved that David's place was here, that his guardianship belonged with Michael. Even Laura, watching her nephew flourish, withdrew her custody claim, acknowledging that some families are built on bonds stronger than blood. In the quiet moments between batches, David often stood at the factory windows, watching customers line up outside, eager to taste his latest creations. Each chocolate he made carried a piece of his heart, a tribute to the two families whose legacies he now carried forward, the Harrisons and the Ryans, united by a boy who found his calling in the sweet science of chocolate making. "Your chocolates don't just taste good," a customer told him one day. "They make people happy. They bring back memories. They create new ones." David smiled, thinking of all the stories yet to be told through his creations. "That's the real magic of chocolate," he replied, echoing Michael's words. "It's not just about what you taste, it's about what you feel." And in the warmth of the factory kitchen, surrounded by the scent of melting chocolate and the hum of machines his mother once used, David Ryan had finally found the ingredient that made everything sweeter: belonging. The legal notice arrived on the morning of Michael's surgery, delivered by Vicente's newest lawyer, despite the man himself being under house arrest. The document threatened to expose Michael's past gambling debts to the medical board, potentially halting the life-saving procedure unless the factory was signed over immediately. "You think you've won," Vicente's handwritten note read, "but I still hold all the cards. You have 1 hour to decide the factory or Michael's life." David stood in the hospital corridor, the papers crumpled in his trembling hands. Through the window, he could see Michael being prepped for surgery, unaware of the cruel choice being forced upon them. Laura, who'd been helping with pre-surgery paperwork, read the documents over his shoulder. "He's desperate," she said, her voice tight with anger. "The police have frozen his assets, his reputation is ruined, but he's still trying to destroy what you built." "He's not just threatening the factory," David replied, his voice steady despite his fear. "He's trying to take away the only father I have left. Again." A call from the factory made the situation even more dire. Vicente's associates had begun spreading rumors about health code violations, causing several major clients to put their orders on hold. Bank representatives were asking questions about the source of their recent success, implying fraud. "It's a coordinated attack," Tom Anderson reported over the phone. "They're trying to crush us from all sides before Michael's surgery is complete." David looked at the surgery countdown clock. then at the 1-hour deadline in Vicente's letter. His mind raced through options, remembering everything he'd learned about business, about family, about fighting for what mattered. Get everyone to the factory, he told Tom. Every worker, every supporter, and call the local news. It's time to show Vicente what real power looks like. Within 30 minutes, the street outside Harrison's chocolate factory had become a sea of people. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder with customers. Local business owners linked arms with families who'd grown up on Harrison's chocolates. David's chocolate-making students, children, and adults alike held up signs supporting the factory. Vicente's lawyer arrived to find his path blocked by determined faces. "This is private property," he began, but David cut him off. "No," the boy declared, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This is community property. Every person here owns a piece of what we've built. You can threaten us, try to bankrupt us, spread lies about us, but you cannot break us." Laura stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I'm live streaming this to every news outlet that covered Vicente's arrest. Want to explain to them why you're threatening a child and a sick man." The lawyer faltered, but another figure emerged from a black car, Vicente himself, having violated his house arrest in a final desperate move. "You're just like your mother," he snarled at David. "She didn't understand business either. Sentiment doesn't pay bills. Look what it got her." The crowd's murmur turned dangerous. David felt the community's anger rising behind him, but he kept his voice calm. "My mother understood that some things are worth more than money. Mr. Michael taught me the same thing. That's why you'll never win. You can't buy or steal what makes this place special." Vicente laughed coldly. "Special? It's a dyeing factory run by a gambling addict and an orphan. In an hour, your precious Michael will lose his surgery slot, and then what will you have?" "He'll have us," Mrs. Anderson stepped forward. "All of us. My husband's law firm is ready to file harassment charges. The Historical Society has already designated this building a protected landmark." Others joined in, each offering protection, support, legal aid. The local bank manager announced they were approving an emergency loan. Restaurant owners pledged to double their orders. Parents whose children David had taught chocolate making offered to prepay for a year of classes. Vicente's face twisted as he watched his leverage crumble. "You're all fools. This isn't a fairy tale. Business is about profit, not people." "No," Vicente, Laura interrupted. "That's where you've always been wrong. Business is about both. Sarah knew that. Michael knows it. And David, he's proven it by bringing this community together." Sirens wailed in the distance, police responding to Vicente's house arrest violation. The crowd parted silently as officers approached, their faces grim. "Mr. Morris," the lead officer called, "step away from the factory. You're in violation of multiple court orders." As Vicente was led away, he shouted back at David, "This isn't over. You'll never be able to prove what happened to your parents." But David wasn't listening. His phone had lit up with a message from Dr. Thompson. Michael was being wheeled into surgery. The operation would proceed as planned. "You're wrong," David called after Vicente's retreating figure. "It is over. You lost the moment you thought fear was stronger than love." The crowd cheered as the police car drove away. Inside the factory, David gathered everyone together. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But our work isn't done. We have orders to fill, customers to serve, and in a few hours we'll have good news about Mr. Michael to celebrate." As people returned to their posts, Laura touched David's shoulder gently. "Sarah would be so proud of how you handled that. You showed strength without losing your compassion, just like she always did." David looked around at the factory floor, bustling with activity, alive with purpose and community. Vicente had tried to break them by attacking their weakest points, but he'd only revealed their greatest strength: unity. "Mom always said chocolate brings people together," David smiled. "I don't think even she imagined how true that could be." The morning dawned cold and grey as police vehicles surrounded Harrison's chocolate factory. Despite Vicente's arrest, his legal machinery had ground forward, resulting in an emergency eviction order. David stood at the factory entrance, Michael's wheelchair beside him, facing a line of officers and court officials. "You have 1 hour to vacate the premises," the lead officer announced, his voice professionally neutral but his eyes sympathetic. "After that, we're authorized to remove you by force if necessary." Behind them, the factory hummed with activity. Workers continued making chocolate, filling orders, refusing to acknowledge the deadline. The community had gathered again, forming a human chain around the building. Local news crews documented everything, their cameras capturing the tension crackling in the air. "This order is based on fraudulent claims," Michael's lawyer argued, waving documents. "We have proof that Vicente Morris falsified records, manipulated accounts." "That will be for the courts to decide," the court officer interrupted. "For now, the order stands." David squeezed Michael's shoulder, drawing strength from his mentor's presence. Just 3 days after surgery, Michael should have been resting, but he'd insisted on being here. "We're not leaving," David announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This factory isn't just a building, it's our home. Our family." Laura pushed through the police line, her designer suit dusty from the morning's work in the chocolate kitchen. "I have evidence," she called out, holding up a thumb drive. "Proof that Vicente's development company never legally acquired the rights to this property. The original deed shows." A commotion at the back of the crowd interrupted her. Vicente's legal team arrived, led by a senior partner from the city's most prestigious firm. "Whatever evidence MS. Reynolds claims to have is irrelevant," he announced. "The eviction order stands." But David had been preparing for this moment. He nodded to Tom Anderson, who opened the factory doors wide. The scent of chocolate wafted out, accompanied by the sound of machines running smoothly. Inside, every surface gleamed, every worker stood at their station, and along the walls hung framed documents, health inspections, safety certificates, historical preservation awards. "Before you enforce that order," David said clearly, "you should know what you're destroying. This factory employs 35 people. It provides specialized chocolate to 12 local restaurants and supplies free chocolate-making classes to underprivileged kids. We're not just making candy, we're preserving a century of history." The police sergeant stepped forward, examining the scene. His own grandmother's picture hung among the historical photos, showing her working the enrobing line in 1955. "The order requires immediate cessation of operations," he said slowly. "But it doesn't specify how immediate is immediate." Understanding flashed between him and David. The boy turned to the waiting crowd. "We have orders to fill. Anyone who wants to help save Harrison's chocolates, now's the time." People surged forward, lawyers offering pro bono services, business owners pledging support, families sharing stories of what the factory meant to their community. The news crews captured it all, broadcasting live as ordinary citizens took stands at chocolate-making stations, learning from experienced workers how to keep production going. Michael watched with tears in his eyes as David coordinated everything, his young voice strong and sure as he directed volunteers, encouraged workers, and never stopped making chocolate. This was no longer just about saving a factory, it was about defending the heart of a community. The court officer checked his watch repeatedly, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. The eviction deadline came and went, but no one moved to enforce it. How could they, when grandmothers were teaching children how to temper chocolate, when local chefs were collaborating with factory workers on new recipes, when the very air was thick with the smell of hope and determination? "We'll need to report this," the officer finally said, but there was no force behind his words. Report what? David asked innocently, offering him a freshly made truffle. That a community came together to preserve its heritage. That people chose love over fear, tradition over profit. The officer took the chocolate, smiled slightly, and led his team back to their vehicles. The crowd's cheer shook the factory windows. But David wasn't finished. He wheeled Michael to the center of the factory floor, where a small stage had been set up. "Mr. Michael," he said, his voice carrying over the suddenly quiet crowd, "would you do the honors of announcing our new initiative?" Michael straightened in his wheelchair, color returning to his face as he spoke. "Harrison's Chocolates is proud to announce the establishment of the Sarah Ryan Memorial Apprenticeship Program, offering full scholarships to young people who dream of becoming chocolatiers, because everyone deserves a chance to create something sweet out of life's bitter moments." The applause was deafening. Laura wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her nephew help Michael back to his office. They'd bought time, precious time, to fight the eviction legally, to prove Vicente's fraud, to save not just a building but a legacy. Outside, the police cars drove away, leaving behind a community more united than ever. The factory continued its work, its machines singing an ancient song of creation and perseverance, its people moving in the dance of shared purpose. David returned to his workstation, picked up his chocolate brush and smiled. Some battles were won not with force, but with sweetness, not with power, but with love. And Harrison's chocolate factory had love in abundance. The family court buzzed with tension as David sat between Michael and Laura, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Despite Vicente's arrest, his influence still reached far. The judge presiding over the guardianship hearing was a longtime friend of his law firm. "This is a complicated case," Judge Marshall began, peering over her glasses at the assembled parties. "We have a minor who has formed an attachment to his temporary guardian, but there are serious concerns about Mr. Harrison's ability to provide proper care." Michael's lawyer stood, presenting medical records showing his successful recovery from surgery. "My client's health has stabilized. The factory is profitable again. David has flourished under his care." And yet the opposing counsel interrupted. "Mr. Harrison has a documented history of gambling addiction. The factory's current success relies heavily on a child's labor. Is this really in David's best interest?" David shot to his feet, unable to contain himself. "It's not labor, it's love. Mr. Michael taught me everything I know. He gave me a home when nobody else would." "David," the judge's voice softened, "I understand your feelings, but we must consider your long-term welfare. MS Reynolds has offered to provide." She knew. David cut in, his voice trembling. "She knew what happened to my parents and said nothing. She let Vicente put me in that orphanage. How is that better?" Laura stood slowly, her designer suit a sharp contrast to her humbled demeanor. "Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw my petition for guardianship." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "I've watched David with Michael. I've seen how they support each other, how they built something remarkable together. My desire to make amends doesn't give me the right to separate them." The judge frowned. "MS Reynolds, your financial stability and family connection mean nothing compared to love." Laura finished. "My sister David's mother believed in choosing love over convenience. I dishonored her memory once by staying silent. I won't do it again." Michael wheeled himself forward, his voice steady despite his obvious fatigue. "Your Honor, I'm not a perfect man. I've made mistakes, faced my demons. But David, he gave me reason to fight, to be better. We saved each other." The social worker assigned to David's case approached the bench, presenting her report. "In my 30 years of experience, I've rarely seen such a positive transformation. David's grades have improved dramatically. He's developing valuable business and artistic skills. Most importantly, he's found stability and purpose." "Through child labor," the opposing counsel insisted. "Through apprenticeship," David corrected, pulling out his lesson plans and certificates. "We've started a program teaching other kids chocolate making. Everything I learn, I share. Mr. Michael makes sure I do my homework before working in the factory. He comes to my parent-teacher conferences. David's voice caught. "He loves me. Not because he has to, but because he chooses to. Isn't that what family really means?" The judge studied the documents before her: medical reports, school records, financial statements, and dozens of letters from community members supporting Michael's guardianship. More telling were the photographs showing David and Michael working side by side, their joy evident even in candid shots. "Mr. Harrison," she addressed Michael directly, "raising a child is an enormous responsibility. Your health is better than ever." Michael smiled at David. "Having a son to live for is the best medicine I could ask for." A woman stood up in the gallery, David's teacher. "Your Honor, may I speak?" At the judge's nod, she continued. David used to be withdrawn, angry. Now he tutors other students in math using chocolate measurements. He's writing a cookbook for kids. He's not just learning a trade, he's finding his voice. More community members rose to speak. The local baker who'd seen David comfort a crying child with a chocolate-making lesson, the librarian who helped him research business laws, the elderly neighbor whose grocery shopping David did every Sunday after factory hours. The judge held up her hand for silence, studying David intently. "Young man, if I grant Mr. Harrison guardianship, what assurance do I have that your education won't suffer?" David straightened. "Mr. Michael made me promise straight A's or no chocolate making. But it's not hard to study when you love what you're learning. The factory teaches me chemistry, physics, math, business, art, and family. Isn't that what education is really about?" The courtroom held its breath as Judge Marshall removed her glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully. "I've reviewed all the evidence, heard compelling testimony from both sides. But perhaps the most convincing argument isn't in any of these documents, it's standing right in front of me." She looked at David and Michael, seeing not a sick man and an orphan, but a father and son who had chosen each other. Petition for guardianship is granted to Michael Harrison, with periodic reviews to ensure continued stability. The courtroom erupted in cheers. David threw his arms around Michael, both of them crying openly. Laura watched from her seat, a bittersweet smile on her face, knowing she'd finally done right by her sister's son. As they left the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in colors as warm as melted chocolate. David pushed Michael's wheelchair, already discussing plans for tomorrow's production. "We'll need to celebrate," Michael said softly. David grinned. "I know just the recipe, Mom's special hot chocolate, the one that tastes like home." Because sometimes family isn't about who you're born to, but who you choose to share your life and your chocolate with. The first warning sign came during the celebration of David's official adoption. Michael was teaching a group of children how to pipe chocolate flowers when his hands began to shake uncontrollably. The delicate rose he'd been creating splattered across the workbench, dark droplets spattering like blood. Mr. Michael David was at his side instantly, catching him as he swayed. "Someone call an ambulance." The factory erupted into controlled chaos. Laura cleared the children away while Tom Anderson grabbed the emergency oxygen tank they kept for Michael. But this time was different. Michael's lips were turning blue, his eyes struggling to focus. "Stay with me," David pleaded, holding his father's hand as the paramedics rushed in. "Please, Dad, we've only just become official. You can't leave now." The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and medical jargon. Dr. Thompson met them at the emergency entrance, her face grave as she reviewed Michael's vitals. "The surgery site is showing signs of infection. His body's rejecting some of the post-operative medications." David refused to leave Michael's side, even when nurses tried to escort him to the waiting room. "I'm his son," he said firmly, showing the newly signed adoption papers. "Legally and in every way that matters." Through the night, David watched as machines beeped and doctors consulted in hushed voices. Michael's fever spiked dangerously high, his body fighting against both infection and treatment. In quiet moments between nurse visits, David whispered stories about their plans for the factory, new recipes they would create together, anything to keep his father tethered to life. Laura brought David's chocolate-making tools from the factory. Sometimes she said softly, "Love needs something to do with its hands." Understanding, David began tempering small batches of chocolate by Michael's bedside, filling the sterile hospital air with the familiar scent of home. Dr. Thompson found him there at dawn, carefully piping tiny chocolate flowers. "The next 24 hours are critical," she explained gently. "His body's been through so much: the surgery, the stress of the adoption battle, running the factory." "He's strong," David insisted, placing a perfect chocolate rose on Michael's bedside table. "Stronger than anyone knows." But that afternoon, Michael's heart stopped. David watched in horror as medical staff rushed in with defibrillators, his father's body arching off the bed with each shock. Time seemed to stretch like pooled sugar, each second an eternity of fear. "Come on, Dad," David whispered, clutching his mother's recipe book like a talisman. "Remember what you taught me: sometimes the best chocolates take time, patience, and faith. You can't give up before the batch is finished." After what felt like hours, a steady beep returned to the monitors. Michael's heart was beating again, but he remained unconscious. Dr. Thompson explained that the extended cardiac episode might have caused complications. "There's a risk of brain damage," she said carefully. "We won't know more until he wakes up, if he wakes up." David nodded, his young face set with determination. "Then we'll wait, and while we wait, we'll remind him what he has to wake up for." He set up a small tempering station by the window, the familiar motions of chocolate making keeping his hands busy while his heart held vigil. Other chocolatiers from the factory took shifts, ensuring the room always smelled of chocolate and hope. On the third day, as David was explaining to an unconscious Michael how to achieve the perfect snap in a dark chocolate bar, a weak voice interrupted. "You're tempering it too hot." David's head snapped up to see Michael's eyes open, tired but alert. "Dad." The machines confirmed what seemed impossible. Michael was not only awake but fully aware, his mind as sharp as ever. Dr. Thompson called it remarkable. The nurses called it a miracle. But David knew better. It was the chocolate, he told Michael later, as his father slowly sipped water. "Mum always said it had healing properties. Not just the eating, the making of it, the love you put into each batch." Michael squeezed his son's hand. "It wasn't the chocolate, David. It was you. Every time I started to drift away, I heard your voice, smelled the chocolate you were making, felt your faith in me. How could I not come back?" Recovery would be slow, the doctors warned. But watching David organize shift schedules for both the factory and hospital visits, seeing his son balance schoolwork with chocolate-making demonstrations by the hospital bed, Michael knew they would manage. "We're chocolatiers," David reminded him, carefully wrapping a fresh batch of truffles. "We know all about transformation, taking something bitter, treating it with patience and love, and turning it into something beautiful." As Michael grew stronger, the hospital room became an extension of their chocolate kitchen. Nurses stopped by for chocolate-making tips, doctors prescribed therapeutic tempering sessions, and the entire ward seemed to heal a little faster, wrapped in the sweet scent of possibility. Because sometimes the strongest medicine isn't found in pills or injections, but in the unwavering love of a son for his father, in the gentle art of making chocolate, and in the faith that every bitter moment can be transformed into something sweet. The accusation hit like a thunderbolt on what should have been a triumphant morning. Michael had just returned to the factory after his recovery when Vicente's final revenge arrived in the form of a police detective and 2 officers. David Ryan, the detective's voice, cut through the busy factory floor. "We need to ask you some questions about missing funds from the factory accounts." Michael, still pale from his hospital stay, gripped his wheelchair's armrests. "This is ridiculous. David's been running the factory honestly and successfully." The detective laid out bank statements and transaction records. "According to these documents, someone has been making unauthorized withdrawals, small amounts at first, but adding up to significant sums. The account access codes matched those assigned to David Ryan. The workers gathered around, disbelief on their faces. They'd watched David work tirelessly, seen his dedication to saving the factory. Tom Anderson stepped forward, shaking his head. There must be some mistake. David would never. But the evidence seemed damning. Security footage showed someone David's size accessing the factory office late at night. Bank records showed transfers to an unknown account. Even some of their most loyal customers had reported discrepancies in their billing. "It's Vicente," Laura declared, examining the documents. "He must have planted this evidence. He's trying to destroy David's credibility before the final custody hearing." The detective remained impassive. "Mrs. Reynolds, your brother is under house arrest. These transactions occurred after his detention." David stood silent, chocolate-stained hands clenched at his sides. The recipe book his mother had left him lay open on the workbench, its pages seeming to mock him with memories of trust and tradition. "Search my locker," he finally said, voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Check my computer. I have nothing to hide." The search revealed more damning evidence, printed bank statements, transfer receipts, all pointing to David's involvement. The workers began to whisper, doubt creeping into their eyes. Even some of David's strongest supporters started to question their faith in the young chocolatier. "I trusted you," Michael whispered, pain evident in his voice. "I gave you everything, my name, my factory, my heart." David's composure finally broke. "Dad, please. You know me. Everything I've done has been for you, for the factory, for our family. I would never." But the police had to follow procedure. As they led David away for questioning, he looked back at the factory, his home, his dream, his sanctuary. The sight of Michael's devastated face would haunt him more than any prison cell could. Laura watched the scene unfold, her investigator's instincts firing. Something about the evidence felt too perfect, too neat. Vicente might be under house arrest, but his influence reached far. And somewhere in the paper trail, she knew there had to be a flaw in his plan. As David was escorted out, a small chocolate wrapper fell from his pocket, one of the first pieces he'd ever made under Michael's guidance. It landed at Michael's feet, the factory's logo gleaming gold against dark chocolate, a bitter reminder of sweet beginnings now turned sour. The factory floor fell silent, machines still humming but hearts frozen in disbelief. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, family, and the fragile bonds that held their community together. Michael picked up the chocolate wrapper with trembling fingers and for a moment caught the faintest whiff of Sarah's special recipe, the one only David had been able to recreate perfectly. In that scent lay a truth his heart knew, even if his mind was clouded by evidence and accusation. A child who could capture his mother's love in chocolate couldn't be capable of such betrayal, could he? The news spread through the town like spilled chocolate, bitter and impossible to contain. Harrison S. Eyre, accused of theft, screamed the local newspaper headlines. The same community that had rallied to save the factory now whispered behind closed doors, sharing theories and suspicions. "Always seemed too good to be true," muttered Mrs. Peterson, who'd previously praised David's chocolate-making classes. She cancelled her standing order for birthday truffles. An orphan boy suddenly becoming a master chocolatier. Should have known better. The factory's previously bustling storefront grew quiet. Regular customers found excuses to shop elsewhere. Parents withdrew their children from David's teaching programs, leaving the classroom empty except for the lingering scent of chocolate and broken dreams. Michael sat in his office, surrounded by order cancellations and concerned emails from business partners. Each one felt like a personal betrayal, not of him, but of David. Despite the evidence, something in his heart refused to believe his son capable of theft. "They're calling him a con artist," Tom Anderson reported grimly, placing another stack of cancelled orders on Michael's desk, saying he manipulated everyone, played on their sympathies. Some are even suggesting he caused your health crisis for attention. The accusations grew more outlandish with each passing day. Former supporters now claimed they'd always seen something off about David. The local paper ran an expose questioning everything from his chocolate-making skills to his connection to Sarah Ryan. Perhaps he isn't even Sarah's son, someone suggested at a town meeting. Has anyone actually verified his identity? Laura watched in horror as the community's love curdled into suspicion. The same people who'd stood against Vicente's eviction notice now wondered if they'd been fooled all along. The factory's sales plummeted as rumors spread about tainted chocolate and fraudulent practices. Even the Historical Society suspended the factory's landmark status application. Citing concerns about the integrity of current management, the bank began making noises about reviewing their loans. Michael wheeled himself through the empty factory corridors late one night, touching machines that had hummed with life just days before. Each quiet workstation held memories of David teaching, learning, creating. The chocolate molds sat clean but unused, like tombstones marking the death of trust. "I should have known," a former worker said loudly in the grocery store, making sure Michael could hear. No 12-year-old could be that talented. He must have been stealing recipes along with money. The final blow came when the Children's Hospital cancelled their standing order for special dietary chocolates, David's personal project, designed to bring joy to sick kids. The rejection letter praised the program's success, but cited reputational concerns. Michael found the letter crumpled in his office, stained with what looked suspiciously like tears. On his desk sat David's last creation before his arrest, a perfect chocolate rose, now wilting in the warm air. Beside it lay his mother's recipe book, its pages marked with David's careful notes and modifications. "The boy played us all for fools," someone had spray-painted on the factory wall. The red letters glared accusingly in the morning sun, but Michael couldn't bring himself to wash them away. Each harsh word felt like a judgment on his own failure to protect his son. Laura tried to rally support, reminding people of David's contributions to the community. But doubt, once planted, grew like weeds through a garden, choking out the flowers of previous kindness. The factory stood like a ghost of itself, machines silent, display cases empty. The same community that had formed a human chain to protect it now hurried past with averted eyes, as if chocolate making had become something shameful. In his cell, David could probably smell the chocolate that still clung to his clothes, a bittersweet reminder of everything he'd lost. But in the factory, Michael sat alone, surrounded by the wreckage of their dreams, clinging to one unshakable truth: love. Like the finest chocolate, could be bitter or sweet, but it never, ever lied. The stress of David's arrest proved too much for Michael's fragile recovery. Late one night, as he sat reviewing security footage for the 100th time, searching for proof of his son's innocence, the familiar crushing pain returned to his chest. Tom Anderson found him slumped over his desk, Sarah's recipe book clutched to his heart, breaths coming in shallow gasps. The ambulance wail pierced the quiet factory night, a mournful echo of previous crises. "He's had a severe relapse," Dr. Thompson explained to Laura in the emergency room. The emotional trauma combined with his weakened state. His body simply couldn't take it. "We've had to place him in a medically induced coma to prevent further damage." In his juvenile detention cell, David received the news with a kind of numb horror. "Please," he begged the guard, "I need to see him. He's my father." What if he'd the words stuck in his throat, too terrible to voice? The authorities remained unmoved. "You're a flight risk," they said, "and given the charges against you, the Harrison family has requested no contact." "I am the Harrison family," David's shout echoed down the concrete corridors. "He adopted me. He chose me. Please." Laura used every legal means at her disposal to arrange a supervised visit, but bureaucracy moved slowly. Meanwhile, Michael lay still and pale, machines monitoring every breath, every heartbeat. The hospital room filled with wilting flowers from sympathetic community members, the same people who'd turned against David. The factory remained closed, its machines gathering dust. The chocolate in the tempering vats had solidified, unshaped and unsold. Tom Anderson visited daily, running essential maintenance, refusing to let Michael's life's work completely slip away. At night, when visiting hours ended, Laura would sit by Michael's bed, speaking softly of her discoveries. "The evidence against David is too perfect," she'd whisper. "Vicente's fingerprints are all over this, but I can't prove it yet. Hold on, Michael. Give me time to make this right." David's court-appointed lawyer brought him hospital updates along with case documents. "Your father's condition is stable," she'd say, watching the boy's face crumple with relief and worry. "But the doctors say he needs something to fight for." In his cell, David began writing letters he couldn't send, filling pages with memories of their time together, chocolate recipes they'd created, dreams for the factory's future. Each one ended the same way: "Please don't give up, Dad. I need you to believe in me one more time." The machines in Michael's room beeped steadily, marking time in electronic pulses. Occasionally his fingers would twitch, as if tempering invisible chocolate, teaching lessons to a son he couldn't reach. Dr. Thompson noted these movements in her reports. "He's responding to memory stimuli," she explained to Laura. "Whatever his conscious mind believes about David, his heart remembers truth." One night, a nurse found Laura crying over a small chocolate bar, one of David's last creations before his arrest. "In all my years at the factory," Laura said softly, "I never tasted anything that captured Sarah's spirit like David's chocolates. How could we have doubted him?" The hospital room fell quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Outside, autumn winds stripped leaves from trees, while inside a father's heart kept beating, waiting for proof of what it had never truly doubted: his son's innocence. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning when Laura was reviewing security footage for the 1000th time. There, in a frame so brief most would miss it, she caught the reflection of someone entering the factory office, someone much taller than David, wearing an expensive suit. "Stop right there," she told the tech expert she'd hired. The image enhanced showed a familiar ring on the intruder's hand, Vicente's family signet, which he'd worn since college. Despite his house arrest, he'd found a way to plant the evidence himself. Laura's hands shook as she dialed Detective Rogers. "I need you to see something." Now her voice carried the weight of weeks of investigation, of watching both Michael and David suffer for her brother's crimes. The detective arrived at the factory within the hour. As the footage played, his professional skepticism gave way to focused interest. "This timing matches perfectly with when the false records were created," he noted, checking his files. But Morris was under house arrest. "Check his ankle monitor data," Laura suggested, pulling up more files. "I found irregularities in the reporting system, brief gaps that shouldn't exist. Someone hacked it, created a loop of him appearing to stay home." The evidence unraveled quickly after that. The bank transfers supposedly made by David were traced to an IP address belonging to one of Vicente's shell companies. The security footage showing someone David's size had been carefully edited, professional work, but not perfect. Here the tech expert pointed to subtle digital artifacts. These frames were manipulated. The height proportions are slightly off. Someone took footage of David's normal nighttime work and altered it to look suspicious. Detective Rogers organized a pre-dawn raid on Vicente's house. They found him attempting to delete files, but not quickly enough. His computer revealed everything: the carefully orchestrated plan to frame David, the doctored evidence, even emails discussing how to maximize the community's reaction. "Turn on the news," Laura told David's lawyer over the phone. "It's all coming out." The morning news blazed with headlines. Prominent lawyer caught in elaborate frame-up. Security footage showed Vicente being led from his house in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled from the early morning arrest. More damning revelations followed. Vicente's conspiracy reached deep into local government, including officials who'd expedited David's arrest. The fabricated evidence had been carefully planted over weeks, taking advantage of the community's readiness to believe the worst of an orphan boy. Laura stormed into the juvenile detention center, warrant in hand. "Release him." Now her voice brooked no argument. The same guard who'd denied David's hospital visits now couldn't move fast enough to open his cell. David emerged into the morning sunlight, blinking like a creature from darkness. "Mr. Michael," he asked immediately. "Is he?" "Still unconscious," Laura replied gently. "But Detective Rogers is heading to the hospital now with proof of your innocence. It's over, David. Vicente can't hurt either of you anymore." The boy's shoulders slumped with relief, then straightened with purpose. "Take me to the factory first," he said firmly. "There's something I need to get." They found Tom Anderson already there, machines humming to life as if they'd known their young master would return. David went straight to his workstation, pulled out fresh ingredients, and began tempering chocolate with practiced movements. "What are you doing?" Laura asked softly. "Making Dad's favorite," David replied, his hands steady despite everything. "The dark chocolate orange truffles. When he wakes up, I want him to smell home." Because sometimes justice tastes like perfectly tempered chocolate, and redemption comes in the form of a boy who never stopped believing in the power of love, even when the whole world doubted him. Laura stood before the assembled media outside Harrison's chocolate factory, her designer suit replaced by a simple blouse and chocolate-stained apron. Behind her, the factory windows gleamed in the morning sun, machines once again humming with life. "I need to confess something," she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. 5 years ago, I helped my brother Vicente orchestrate a series of events that led to the death of my sister, Sarah Ryan, and her husband. I was complicit in actions that left my nephew David an orphan, and for that I can never fully atone." The crowd's murmur grew as she continued, detailing her role in the tragedy, the cancelled insurance, the manipulated records, the years of silence. Each admission seemed to physically pain her, but she pressed on, determined to finally speak the whole truth. "I watched from a distance as David grew up in that orphanage. I sent anonymous gifts, thinking it somehow made up for my cowardice. When I saw him find a home with Michael, find purpose in this factory, I told myself it was better to stay quiet, but my silence only allowed Vicente to hurt him again." David stood in the factory doorway, listening to his aunt bare her soul. His hands were covered in chocolate. He hadn't stopped working since his release, as if making up for lost time. Michael's hospital room was already filled with his creations, each piece infused with hope for his father's recovery. "The truth is," Laura's voice cracked, "I was jealous of Sarah. She chose love over money, passion over security. She built something real with her bakery, while I chased wealth and status. When Vicente presented his plan to acquire the property, I convinced myself we were doing her a favor. I was wrong, so terribly wrong." She turned to face David directly. "Your mother had something, Vicente, and I never understood the courage to follow her heart. She passed that courage to you, and watching you fight for this factory, for Michael, for your dreams, it finally gave me the strength to face what I'd done." Pulling out a thick folder, Laura held it up for the cameras. "This contains everything: banking records, property deeds, insurance documents. Most importantly, it contains Sarah's will, which Vicente helped me hide. David isn't just heir to his mother's bakery, she made Michael Harrison his legal guardian in the event of her death. She knew, somehow, that this factory would become his home." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. David stepped forward, reaching for the documents that connected his past to his present. His mother had known Michael, had trusted him with her son's future. All those years in the orphanage had been unnecessary, a product of Vicente's greed and Laura's silence. "I don't expect forgiveness," Laura said softly, looking at her nephew. "But I hope that by exposing everything, I can give you back some of what was taken. The property where your mother's bakery stood is still vacant. Vicente never developed it. With these documents, it's yours again." She removed her apron, folding it carefully. "I'm turning myself in to the district attorney's office. My testimony will ensure Vicente never hurts anyone again. But before I go," she pulled out one last item, a small, worn notebook. This was Sarah's personal recipe book. The one Vicente claimed was destroyed in the fire. I've kept it all these years, another act of cowardice. It belongs with you now, in this factory where your mother's legacy lives on through your hands. David took the notebook, its pages filled with his mother's handwriting. Inside the cover, an inscription read, "For my son, who will always find sweetness in life's bitter moments. Love, Mom." Tears fell silently as David clutched this piece of his mother's heart. Laura turned to leave, pausing only to whisper, "She would be so proud of you, David. So proud of the family you found, the chocolatier you've become. I hope someday you can be proud of me too, for finally telling the truth." Inside Michael's hospital room, Laura carefully laid out the documents she'd kept hidden for 5 years. David sat beside his unconscious father, one hand holding Michael's, the other tracing his mother's signature on her last will and testament. "She wrote this 3 months before the fire," Laura explained softly. "It was as if she knew something might happen. Listen to this: in the event of my death, I entrust my son David's care to Michael Harrison, whose integrity and kindness have shown me the true meaning of family." David's voice trembled as he read further. "She writes about the factory Michael's chocolate brought joy to my darkest days. His mother taught me that making chocolate isn't just about recipes, it's about love. I know he'll teach David the same." The will detailed everything: the bakery's recipes, the property deeds, even a secret trust fund Vicente had hidden. But more precious than any financial provision were Sarah's words about her son's future. "David has the gift," he read, "tears falling freely. He can taste love in chocolate, just like Michael's mother could. The factory is where he belongs. Michael will understand this, will nurture this gift as Ellen Harrison once nurtured mine." Laura pulled out more documents, photographs of Sarah working in the factory's experimental kitchen with Michael's mother, certificates from chocolate-making courses they'd taken together, letters discussing David's future. "She didn't just know Michael," Laura whispered. "She was being mentored by his mother. They were planning to merge the bakery and factory one day, create something new together. Then Ellen died, Michael started gambling, and Vicente saw his opportunity." A slight movement from the hospital bed drew their attention. Michael's fingers had twitched at the mention of his mother's name. The monitors showed increased brain activity. "Keep reading," the nurse encouraged. "He can hear you." David turned to the will's final page, his mother's last message to him: "My dearest son, if you're reading this, know that I found a way to protect your future. The Harrison family isn't just about chocolate, they're about love, creativity, and the courage to be yourself. Michael may be struggling now, but his heart is pure. Trust him, learn from him, and together you'll create something sweeter than either of us could imagine." Laura produced one final document, a faded photograph showing Sarah and Ellen Harrison standing proudly in the factory kitchen. Between them stood a young Michael, and in Sarah's arms was a baby David, tiny hands reaching for a chocolate mold. "Your first time in the factory," Laura said softly. "You were 6 months old. Sarah said you stopped crying the moment you smelled the chocolate." The machines monitoring Michael's condition began showing stronger readings. His hand tightened around David's ever so slightly. "She knew," David whispered, looking at his father's face. "Mom knew we'd find each other again. That's why she made sure I'd end up here with him." Laura touched the photograph gently. "Sarah believed in fate, in the way love finds its way home. Vicente and I thought we'd destroyed her plans, but somehow you still found your way back to where you belonged." In his bed, Michael's eyes flickered beneath their lids, as if seeing a memory of 2 women working side by side in his factory, planning a future that would take longer than expected to arrive, but arrive it did. Because sometimes the sweetest truths take time to reveal themselves, like chocolate slowly tempering to perfection. The first thing Michael smelled when he finally opened his eyes was chocolate, specifically his mother's signature orange spiced truffles. David sat beside the hospital bed, carefully tempering a small batch on a portable warmer the nurses had allowed him to bring in. "Welcome back," Dad, David said softly, his hands never stopping their careful work. "I've been practicing while you slept. Want to check my technique?" Michael's voice was weak, but his eyes were clear as he watched his son's movements. "Perfect form," he whispered. "Just like your mother used to do it." The room was filled with chocolate creations, each piece marking another day of Michael's recovery, each recipe telling part of their story. On the windowsill stood a chocolate sculpture of the factory, detailed down to the tiny windows where their journey had begun. "I read Mom's will," David said, carefully pouring the tempered chocolate into molds. "She knew, Dad. She knew you'd be my father someday." Michael reached for David's hand, noticing how the boy's fingers were permanently stained with chocolate now, just like his own had been at that age. "I wish I'd known," he said. "All those years you spent in that orphanage." "Don't," David interrupted gently. "We found each other anyway. Mom was right about that, about everything." Dr. Thompson entered with adoption papers and release forms, smiling at the familiar scent of chocolate that had become a constant in the hospital wing. "Your latest tests are excellent, Mr. Harrison. Though I suspect the unorthodox therapy helped." She nodded toward the chocolate-making equipment. "The best medicine," Michael agreed, signing the papers with a steady hand. "Now about making this official." The adoption ceremony was held in the factory kitchen, where it all began. Michael, still in a wheelchair but growing stronger daily, wore his old chocolatier's apron. David stood beside him in a matching one, their hands equally marked by their craft. David Ryan Harrison, the judge pronounced, making official what their hearts had known for months. A fitting name for a young man who carries two great legacies. The factory workers erupted in cheers, throwing chocolate sprinkles instead of rice. Laura, who'd been granted leave from her pre-trial detention to attend, watched from the back, tears mixing with her smile. "Your mother would be so proud," she told David later, as he showed her the changes he'd made to the production line. "Both your mothers, Sarah and Ellen Harrison." Michael wheeled himself to his son's workstation, where the chocolate rose David had made during his arrest still stood preserved under glass. "I never doubted you," he said quietly. "Not really. My heart knew what my head forgot for a while." David began tempering a fresh batch of chocolate, his movements sure and practiced. "I know, Dad, just like I knew you'd come back to us. Some things you can taste in chocolate, like love, like truth." Together, they created a special batch of celebration truffles, Michael guiding from his wheelchair while David executed each step perfectly. The recipe combined Sarah Ryan's spice blend with Ellen Harrison's signature technique, a true marriage of their family's legacies. As the evening sun painted the factory windows in amber light, Michael watched his son teach a group of visiting children how to pipe chocolate letters. David's voice carried the same passion Ellen had shown years ago, the same patience Sarah had always embodied. The secret, David told his young students, isn't in the ingredients, it's in the love you put into making it. That's what makes chocolate magic. Michael closed his eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of tempering chocolate. In that moment, he could almost see Ellen and Sarah watching over their children, the son who had lost his way and found it again through a boy's love, and the boy who had always been destined to bring healing through chocolate. Sometimes, he realized, the sweetest adoptions are the ones that were written in the stars, or in this case in chocolate all along. The idea came to David one rainy afternoon as he watched a group of children press their noses against the factory's window, their faces showing the same longing he'd once felt. "Dad," he said, turning to Michael, "I know what Mum meant about creating something sweeter than we could imagine." Within months, Harrison's chocolate factory transformed its upper floor into the Sarah Ryan Chocolate Academy for orphaned youth. The program combined traditional education with chocolate-making skills, giving children not just a trade, but a sense of belonging. "Every child deserves to taste sweetness," David told the local paper during the academy's opening. Not just in chocolate, but in life. The first class consisted of 12 students from local orphanages, each wearing a pristine white apron emblazoned with the factory's logo. Michael, now walking with a cane, supervised the transformation with pride. The old storage rooms became dormitories, each decorated with vintage chocolate advertisements and equipped with small tempering stations. The experimental kitchen, where David had first discovered his gift, became a classroom where children learned both mathematics and the art of ganache. "We're not just teaching them to make chocolate," Michael explained to potential donors. "We're teaching them what my son taught me, that family can be found in the most unexpected places." Laura, serving her reduced sentence through community service, helped establish a scholarship fund using the recovered money from Vicente's fraud. Sarah always said chocolate could heal hearts, she remarked, watching a young girl master her first truffle. "I never understood until now." The academy quickly became known for more than its chocolate. Social workers reported remarkable transformations in the children's behavior and confidence. Like David before them, they found purpose in the precise art of chocolate making, pride in creating something beautiful. One morning, David found a small chocolate rose on his workbench, clumsily made but full of heart. The note attached read, "Thank you for showing us that orphans can become masters too." He displayed it proudly next to his first chocolate rose, a reminder of how far he'd come. The factory's production line now included a special student selection box, featuring chocolates made by academy students. Each piece came with the young chocolatier's story, and the boxes consistently sold out despite premium pricing. All proceeds went to expanding the program. "Remember your first night here?" Michael asked David as they watched the students practice tempering. "How you slept in that old machine because you had nowhere else to go?" David nodded, helping a young boy adjust his chocolate's temperature. "Now, no child will ever have to do that again. They'll have proper beds, proper training, proper love." The Academy's success sparked similar programs worldwide. Other chocolate makers began opening their doors to orphaned youth, creating a network of opportunities. Harrison's graduates were highly sought after, known for both their technical skills and their understanding of chocolate's deeper meaning. Some evenings, after the students had gone to bed, David would find Michael in the experimental kitchen, teaching a particularly dedicated child some special technique. The scene always reminded him of his own early lessons of finding family in the gentle art of chocolate making. "Your mother would be proud," Michael often said, watching his son mentor the next generation. "Both your mothers would be." The factory's walls, once silent witnesses to loss and betrayal, now rang with children's laughter. Every corner held evidence of young creativity chocolate experiments, hand-drawn designs, dreams taking shape in cocoa and courage. As David stood in the doorway of the Academy's dormitory, watching the children settle in for the night, he remembered his own first glimpse of the factory. Sometimes, he told the eager faces looking up at him, the sweetest home is the one you help build yourself. Because sometimes the greatest transformations come not from changing a place, but from changing lives one child, one chocolate, one moment of belonging at a time. The factory's centennial celebration dawned bright and clear, its renovated facade gleaming in the morning sun. Banners proclaiming 100 years of sweetness fluttered in the breeze as people gathered for what had become much more than a simple anniversary. David stood at the podium, now a tall teenager but still wearing his chocolate-stained apron, Michael beaming proudly beside him. Before them stretched a sea of faces: factory workers, academy students, community members who had journeyed from darkness to light together. 100 years ago, David began, Ellen Harrison started making chocolate in her kitchen, believing that sweetness could change lives. 50 years later, my mother Sarah Ryan learned that lesson in this very factory. Today we celebrate not just chocolate, but the power of love to transform lives. The ceremony unfolded like a perfectly tempered batch of chocolate, smooth, rich with meaning, and full of surprising moments. Each Academy student presented a chocolate creation representing their journey, their stories bringing tears and smiles in equal measure. Laura, recently released and working as the Academy's administrative director, unveiled the memorial garden where Sarah and Ellen's recipes grew as living plants, orange trees, vanilla vines, and spice bushes that would flavor future generations of Harrison's chocolates. "This garden," she explained, "represents the truth my brother never understood. Real wealth grows, transforms, and feeds the soul. It doesn't take, it gives." The highlight came when Michael and David together cut the ribbon on the factory's newest addition, the Vicente Morris Redemption Kitchen, where former inmates learned chocolate making as rehabilitation. The name stood as a reminder that even the bitterest circumstances could yield sweetness. Because everyone, David said, catching Laura's eye, deserves a chance to start again. The celebration culminated in a chocolate tasting unlike any other. Each piece told a story: the original Harrison truffle, Sarah Ryan's spice blend, David's award-winning creations, and new confections from Academy students. Every bite carried memories, hopes, and the promise of futures yet to unfold. As evening fell, Michael found David in the experimental kitchen, tempering a small batch of his mother's special recipe. "You know," Michael said softly, "when you first climbed through that window, I thought I was saving you. Turns out you were saving all of us." David smiled, offering his father a perfectly tempered piece. "We saved each other. That's what family does." Outside, the factory lights illuminated the garden where two legacies had grown into something new. Academy students guided visitors through chocolate tastings, their white aprons proud badges of belonging. Workers who had once doubted David now wore Harrison Ryan Chocolate's badges with pride. The celebration ended with a special moment. Each person in attendance received a chocolate rose, crafted by David using both his mother's techniques. Inside each box, a simple message read in sweetness, "We find home." As the last guests departed, David and Michael stood in the factory doorway, watching their extended family disperse into the evening. The machines hummed contentedly behind them, ready for another day of transforming simple ingredients into moments of joy. "What next?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. David grinned, heading back to his workstation. "We keep making chocolate, Dad. We keep making family." Because sometimes the sweetest endings are really just beginnings in disguise, wrapped in chocolate and crafted with love. If this story of love, redemption, and chocolate touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment resonated with you most? What memories of family and belonging did it stir? Share your own stories of second chances and unexpected families. Support our team by subscribing to the channel and help us continue crafting these heartwarming tales. Every subscription encourages us to bring more moving stories to life. Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who might need a reminder that sometimes the sweetest families are the ones we choose. Together, let's spread more stories that celebrate the power of love, forgiveness, and the magic of starting over.